The more I talked to people about belief in God, the more that I discovered the confusion that's present in both our cultures. Slogans such as, "Who are you to judge?" and "That's hate speech" are replacing discussion of ideas, thoughtful argument, and dialogue on all manner of ethical questions and subjects. Even American universities, which proclaim to be guardians of free thinking, are more frequently shutting down dialogue on hot ethical topics due to peer pressure from within academia and due to protesting from students. Also, with increasing frequency, individuals are claiming the right to have moral authority, the right to have authority on these issues of morality, loosing themselves from any kind of standard of goodness for that morality, following after their own desire, and increasingly labeling those of us who do not agree with them as haters or bigots or other such grotesque words. We live in a confused world in which truth is exchanged for lies. One of those exchanges that's greatly affecting Christians is that tolerance is exchanged for intolerance. And in that exchange, the intolerance that's being proclaimed as the only acceptable tolerance has created quite a dilemma. In fact, it feels as though up has become down, down has become up, or perhaps the whole horizon has just been wiped away altogether. And though our societies believe, or at least hope, that they're becoming freer in thought, they have no idea that they are enslaving themselves to the absurd and deceptive ways of mankind. Years ago, in The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis cautioned us that as a society lets go of an objective basis for morality, a society lets go of a standard of goodness such as God, a society ends up conditioned to believe the subjective values and preferences of a few men. He called these men the conditioners. They are those with the power of voice and the platform to spread their message. While his warning sounds a bit like the introduction of a fictitious dystopian novel, it appears we're reaching the dawn of dystopia. So today, or this morning, our task is to see how Christians can respond, in part, how Christians can respond to the new tolerance by taking some actions. So I'm going to give you 3 actions today. If you stick with me through all my talks, you'll notice I like 3s. Those of you that are new, you'll see I like 3s. So our 3s for today are the adhere to Scripture, address hate speech, and ask questions. All right, so let's look at our first one, which is adhere to Scripture. Now, whether I'm giving this to a group of Christians or to a mixed group or to whomever, I have to start with the Scripture, with the Christian text, because this is where we get our grounding for tolerance. So the first task that we have to do is to ground tolerance in the Christian faith. And as Christians, we need to adhere to this grounding. So we're going to look at Luke 6. That's going to be where we start. Luke 6, verses 27 through 28, 31 through 33, or just Luke 6, 27 and on. So what are we looking at? Well, Jesus he's in the Sermon on the Mount. This is what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And he's been teaching some Beatitudes and Woes. These are short teachings that he gives out, little sentence teachings. And then he enters into a time of broader teaching. And the first one that he broadens out on, that is reported by Luke and Matthew, is the teaching on loving your enemies. Okay, so Luke 6:27, but I've got to back up just to Matthew 5:43 and pick up one thing that Matthew told us that Luke didn't about this whole section. So in Luke, we're going to get Jesus' teaching. In Matthew, we're going to get what he's responding to. So Jesus is actually responding to this. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And then back over to Luke 6. But I say to you who listen, love your enemies, do what is good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you. Just as you want others to do for you, do the same for them. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do what is good to those who do good to you, or who are good to you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners do that. This is an extremely high standard for loving others that Jesus is teaching us. As the Holman New Testament commentary states, anyone can return love for love. Even those who persecute others love people who love them. They do not act mean all the time. They have some people in their own family and inner circle of friends. The worst of people help somebody. And then they go on to say, you cannot pick and choose whom to love. Love everyone. To love everyone is a command of the Lord. And it's a command that is in direct opposition to the human tradition of Jesus' day. That tradition that he mentioned in Matthew 5:43 of loving your neighbor but hating your enemy. You see, love everyone's in direct opposition to intolerance. It's rather the most tolerant view because it requires loving even the worst of people, even people you would call your enemy. It is rather a radical tolerance rooted in love. But why is Jesus' teaching so important and relevant to our topic today? Because we're living in a time when tolerance is changing to mean doing good to those who do good to us. That teaching found in Matthew 5:43 that Jesus spoke against. You see, Jesus' culture had been shaped by the values of the religious leaders who taught this, who taught to love those who were like you and to hate the enemy, hate the other people. And we seem to be cycling around to that same belief. If we look at the tendencies in both our cultures, we find that tolerance is changing to something like this. We do good to those who think like us. We do good to those who act like us. And we do good to those who agree with us. This is the new tolerance. And Jesus directly opposes this ideology because it develops an environment that is a breeding ground for hatred. Why? Why does this environment, why is it a breeding ground for hatred? Because in this environment, people believe, they begin to believe, they do not have to love those with whom they disagree, nor tolerate them, nor love those whom they find offensive. In that environment, people begin to marginalize those who do not think like them, or agree with them, or believe like them. In worst case scenarios, this kind of thinking moves from marginalizing people towards dehumanizing people. And we've seen this before. We've seen what Nazi Germany did to the Jews. And we've seen it in America with what the United States did to African Americans in antebellum slavery. In fact, human history across the world is full of examples of how we've grossly devalued human life. And we currently have an opportunistic environment for breeding hatred that is developing under the new tolerance of today. When we only do good to those who do good to us, we fail to starve hatred. Because humans are so easily swayed into temptation, the temptation of hateful attitudes and actions. Jesus explains in Luke 6, the only environment in which hatred starves is an environment of radical, unconditional love. This is an environment in which people adamantly refuse to seek vengeance or repay evil with evil. And this love is grounded in the nature of God and understood through the teaching of Jesus. Further, this radical love is directly how God handles each one of us in our own rebellion towards him. Instead of doing good only to those who do good, God does good to those who do evil, even to those who hate him. Instead of retribution for evil, God offers radical love through his own sacrifice. Romans 5:8 tells us, "But God showed his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." God's love is true tolerance. So we must adhere to and explain the teaching of Scripture in order to starve hatred. We must love those who are persecuting us, for it's the grounding for true tolerance. And that is no small task, to be sure. There's a lot of unpacking to do with how to love people who are persecuting you, right? But it's that basis that we have underneath. We need to have that love for all of mankind. And I'll tell you, many times I don't want to do it. I had a debate group on Facebook back in the early years of Facebook when it looked more like threads in a classroom, like a class discussion. And I had 3,000 people arguing 800 topics on the existence of God. And I had 3 rules, and one of those rules was you couldn't attack a person, or a people group. No ad hominem. And so many times we had to tell people, this is ad hominem, because they were just calling me names or being very ugly. And not just online, which is where the bastion of ugliness seems to be, but one-on-one, people can get ugly with you. And it's very hard when you're faced with a hostile person to remember to love them. So it's no small task, but this is who we are as Christians. And it is what separates us out from culture. Right? It also gives us a connection with people who understand this tolerance, this issue of true tolerance. So the next 2 steps will be practical helps as we attempt to live out and adhere to Scripture. The second step is to address hate speech. So hate speech, the use of the term hate speech is causing a lot of the tolerance problems in our societies. So the first thing we have to do is figure out, what is this thing? What is hate speech? We got to figure out, how do we define it, where we're getting that from, what does it say in our laws, things like that. So let's look at a couple of definitions according to the laws we have in place. So in America, hate speech is a communication that carries no meaning other than the expression of hatred for some group, especially in circumstances in which the communication is likely to provoke violence. It is an incitement to hatred. It is an incitement to hatred primarily against a group of persons defined in terms of race, ethnicity, national origin, gender, religion, sexual orientation, and the like. Notice the blue words there. I think there's some blue up there. Yep. It has to have no meaning other than the expression of hatred. It's fairly well defined. There's a little bit of wiggle room there, but it can't just be anything. It has to be an expression without any other meaning than to show that I hate some group. One website described these as fighting words. I like that one. I don't know if you have that colloquialism, but fighting words. So words meant to intentionally incite harm, or intentionally to incite violence or to bring harm. You see, fighting words have a different motive than does public debate on controversial topics. Fighting words are intentionally hurtful. The purpose is to rile up emotions and specifically do harm to a human. It's kind of like a premeditated maliciousness. Public debate on controversial topics, however, is very different. The purpose is to discuss subjects such as ethics and trying to do so objectively. If emotional harm comes to a person as a result, it was typically unintentional. So there's typically no malicious intent. Now let's look at I have had a little bit of time to look at some New Zealand grounding for hate speech. Now, I'm no expert on New Zealand law, but I found a couple of places where hate speech is coming from, like how is it being defined here. So one of the places it comes from is Article 61 of the Human Rights Act of 1993. Under racial disharmony, I've combined section A, B, and C. They're not much longer than what you see there, but I've made it a little easier to read. It shall be unlawful for any person to publish or distribute written material, broadcast electronically, or use words in any public space that are threatening, abusive, or insulting, being matter or words likely to excite hostility, and then you can finish that up, against any group of people. Right? This is a broader definition. This encompasses a whole lot more than what ours encompasses. So ours has to have no meaning other than the expression of hatred. This one can just be insulting, abusive, or threatening. So it leaves a lot of ground for what you can put into or what you can call hate speech. It's a little bit broader. However, there are some protections, and that would seem to leave you unprotected. So anybody could say that it was hate speech at any time as long as they were insulted, right? But you have some protections. The barrister Ian Bassett here in New Zealand has made some interpretation of the law that says it means that it's not enough that the material offends people who read it. It actually has to have that second clause. It has to excite hostility. Okay, that still seems a little crazy. Like as long as people get angry, that it would leave you unprotected. So in Section 14 of the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act of 1990, you have some protections. There's some other sections as well, I believe 15 and 16. But in 14, freedom of expression means people can make highly controversial or unpopular remarks. So there is a check on this, right? There's a check. And you need to know that Section 14 gives you some protection. And with so many different views present in our cultures, we really have to walk the hate speech line carefully, right? Because we're starting to see some things in our culture. You don't have Israel Folau. I had a slide. I have it right here. I guess I didn't give it to you. So you can see what's going on with Israel Folau, right? With what he said on Facebook and how that excited the people to make accusations of hate speech, right? So he hasn't been charged with anything as far as I know. Is that correct? He hasn't actually been formally charged. He's not paying any penalties. Okay. Yeah, so there was that protection in place, but you saw the reaction, right? And there's a sort of a societal peer pressure against using terminology that comes directly out of Christian theology. Although I'll caveat that with, I don't think the way that he said it on Facebook was very gracious or kind, but there you go, the problem with social media, right? So let's look at another example. You've got the Dutch parliamentarian Geert Wilders. And in 2011, he was charged with incitement to hatred and discrimination. So incitement to hatred and discrimination. He's charged with hate speech. Now, what caused Geert Wilders to be charged with hate speech? Well, he spoke out against Islam. He spoke out against Islam as an ideology that destroys the freedom of the people, especially freedom of speech. I'm going to share some quotes from his closing statement in his trial in the Netherlands. You can look up his closing statement if you look up "the lights are going out in Europe." So he keeps saying the lights are going out in Europe. And I don't know if that's the title of it, but you'll find it if you look that up. Let me share a few of his quotes with you. He said, freedom of expression is the life source of our Western civilization. Freedom, said the American President Dwight Eisenhower, has its life in the hearts, the actions, the spirit of men, so it must be daily earned and refreshed. Else, like a flower cut from its life-giving roots, it will wither and die. We must live in the truth, said the dissidents under communist rule, because the truth will set us free. Truth and freedom are inextricably connected. We must speak the truth, because otherwise we shall lose our freedom. Well, Wilders was acquitted by the Dutch court. However, I've seen our societies taking strides towards the same ideology that landed Wilders in trial. I'll share some examples from America. We've seen court cases in America as a direct result of Christians holding fast to and expressing their Christian ideology and philosophy, such as the bakers who had, if you don't know the story, the bakers are like people who, not their surname, but actual bakers who make cakes. We have a couple who owned a bakery, and they were Christian, and they had a homosexual couple come up to them and say that they wanted a cake made for their wedding. And this Christian couple said they couldn't do that because it violated their beliefs, their religious beliefs. So the couple sued them, the homosexual couple sued them, and this is in Oregon. And the bakers lost. Okay, so they lost pretty much everything. They're losing their business. They had to shut it down. The Oregon Supreme Court ruled against them. So we're starting to see cases like this in the United States. We're seeing the shutting down of dialogue and debate when Christians hold fast to Christian ethics. It's kind of as if Christians are committing thought crimes. And it bears the initial beginnings of an Orwellian society, as found in George Orwell's famous book, 1984. Though his novel's fictitious, we're seeing emerging signs of our own version of the thought police, such as those who are broadening the term hate speech to where it could become a crime to discuss certain controversial issues or to talk about what it is that you believe and why you believe it. We've seen this with the protesting events in the United States, in which there'll be a diverse presentation on ethics, and one of those people in the presentation will be presenting a Christian worldview. Let me give you an example of that. In the United States, in New York, there was a debate between Frank Turek, who's a Christian apologist, and atheist Michael Shermer, who's the editor of Skeptic magazine at Stony Brook University. And their debate was on whether God or science better explains morality. During the debate, Shermer brought up homosexuality and same-sex marriage as issues of moral progression. Turek did not have homosexuality or anything like that, transgenderism, any comments on that in the bulk of his material. It wasn't until he was pressed with a question during cross-examination, what do you think on this matter? When Turek said he disagreed. He disagreed with Shermer's view. After the debate, a student organization submitted an article to their school asking for Turek to be disallowed a public platform at their university, accusing Turek of hate speech for expressing disagreement on Shermer's view of homosexuality and same-sex marriage. I'm going to read you a quote from the top one is their letter, the student organization's letter. They said this: Turek's propaganda is so far from the truth that it should be self-evident in the 21st century, and especially to the millennial generation that currently attends the university, that a speaker who holds these beliefs should not be given such a prestigious platform to speak in the first place. This is not an issue of free speech, not least because the views that Dr. Turek expresses have already been evaluated and exchanged in public forums countless times, and it has been concluded that they are indeed wrong and harmful. They go on to say free and open debate should be encouraged. But not when what is being said is so clearly wrong and so clearly harmful to others. All right, so both debaters responded to this letter, and you can see the bottom title there, the bottom headline. And they said, on the issue of tolerance, it appears that this organization only wants to tolerate ideas they agree with. That's not tolerance. That's totalitarianism. You can only tolerate ideas you disagree with. So we have the examples. We see what's going on. What are we to do? Well, we need to rebel. We need to rebel with reason and love. As responsible citizens in a free society, we must rebel against the changing of the definition of hate speech that alters hate speech to encompass meaningful discussions, okay, and of a potentially offensive topic. Meaningful discussions. So we need to purposefully and carefully recognize and point out to people the difference between debating a controversial topic and slinging empty fighting words, or standing fast to one's, worldview and slinging empty fighting words. Otherwise, we're going to leave the powerful, vocal few in our society, C.S. Lewis's social conditioners, to begin defining anything as fighting words that differs from their own set of values. But we must always point it out and discuss it in love. As 1 Corinthians 13:1 states, if we speak in the tongues of men or angels but have not love, we are as a clanging cymbal or a noisy gong. An annoyance. We come across as an annoyance. See, I used to teach music in the public school, and so I would have a group of students in front of me playing instruments. I know what it's like when my percussionists are banging a noisy gong. And what it feels like. It feels like an annoyance. You just want it to stop. So we can't be the people that come across as like, wow, well, I don't know what you're saying, and I'm having a hard time understanding you, but I just want you to stop, right? And that's what happens when we speak truth without love. We have to speak the truth in love. And this is why, as Christians, our adherence to Jesus' command to radical tolerance is important. In accordance with what Paul taught the Philippians in 2:3-4, he said, do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others. When we rebel with reason, we have to remember not to run over those who have been marginalized in our history, even at the hands of Christians. So we need to responsibly resist the cultural urge towards shutting down conversation on highly controversial topics. And we can do so by addressing and defining hate speech, but we can also do so by asking a lot of questions. So we have to learn to help others reason through the truth of their own beliefs. This is part of being a light bearer as a Christian believer. We're actually supposed to care deeply and passionately about the truth. So when a person states that something a Christian said, did, or believes in accordance with their Christian faith is intolerant, we need to ask some questions. First of all, what do you mean by that? I actually, like last night, Mark Powell, in answering one of the questions, said you might want to check with the person and ask them first, do you consider yourself a tolerant person? Like, would you tolerate a differing opinion from yours? That's a good question to ask as well. But we're going to get to, I always like to get to grounding what people believe. So one of the things I want to ask first is, what did you mean by that when you accused me of intolerance? Wouldn't that be crazy? Somebody calls you a bigot and you say, what do you mean by that? You know what I mean. No, actually, I don't. So I need you to explain how I'm a bigot. That's the kind of stuff that I actually do. I do that because I want people to have to explain it, not just throw, trash at me. Do you have that quote? Do you have that saying here, throw trash? No, I'm getting yes and no. Come on, Kiwis. Which one is it? So, just throwing junk at people, not ad hominem. All right. Now you know an American colloquialism, throw trash. It has no meaning. It's just, fighting words, right? So what do you mean by that? The accuser of intolerance should clarify their own statement. What we're looking at is in what way was the Christian being intolerant? That's what we need to know. In what way was the Christian being intolerant? And why I'm being so picky on this matter is because we need something specific to discuss. We need to know what was actually the intolerance that occurred. For a couple of reasons. One, we need clarification so we don't make a wrong assumption. Like maybe they're saying one thing, but they mean another. So let's figure out what did they mean? We need to find out what they mean, what they think they mean when they say things to us. So we need clarification so we don't make an assumption. We need to ask them, what do you mean by that? Because for the second reason, we need to know if this is just that name calling or mudslinging, which is not helpful. That's not going to be helpful for anyone, so we need to see if they're just calling us a name. Thirdly, we need to see if there really was any violation of Luke 6 by the Christian. We need to see if we violated Luke 6. Were we actually doing something that went against showing them or demonstrating that great love? And that's very important because the Christian is absolutely accountable to that moral truth. I mean, that's a teaching of Jesus. So what do you mean by that? We gave a couple of reasons. Now let's go back to the first reason. We need clarification on what the intolerant action or words were in order to engage the accusation. If an accuser is not willing to discuss the matter, they're not willing to discuss the accusation that they made, then we're going to be inclined to assume that this is a baseless accusation and that it indeed is just name calling. Okay, it's just throwing trash. This is not, if that's all it is, this is not a very thoughtful or intelligent action. This refusal to clarify on behalf of our accusers. It's more polarizing than anything else. So after hopefully getting some clarification on the accusation of intolerance, we want to discover what made the person think this was intolerance. And to do so, we're going to ask that next question. How do you know that? Or where are you getting that from? The accuser of intolerance needs to thoughtfully and effectively defend their view of tolerance. In order to say that a Christian is being intolerant, a person must have some kind of standard by which they can say they know what is truly tolerant. They have to have a standard for that. We talked a little bit about this last night if you were here in my problem of evil talk. So in order to know what's good, so the standard of goodness, we need to know, or in order to know what's evil, we need to know what's good. This is the same idea. In order to know what's intolerant, you have to have some kind of standard for tolerance. You got to know what is tolerant. What is the standard the person is using in order to say that something's intolerant? This is the standard we're trying to discover when we say, hey, where are you getting that from? Or how do you know that? And you can change. These are the base level questions. You might say, well, why do you think that was intolerant? Or where are you getting that idea of intolerance from? You might have to change it so that they understand it. These are the base questions. So the reason I like to ask these kind of questions is that I often encounter people who are using words like hate speech or intolerance without any grounding for the ideas behind these words. So when I say grounding, I mean a reason for thinking these things are real. Okay. They have to have some kind, these words, these ideas like intolerance and hate speech have to have some kind of existence in order for the accusation to have meaning. If you use these words without grounding, you're just shutting down critical thought. Right? If you just say, well, you're a bigot. Okay, now we have nothing to talk about. You're just calling me a name. Right? And that's a quick way out. Let's discuss what the problem is. Let's discuss why you don't agree with me, rather than calling me a name and shooting out of the conversation. And if this is all we're going to do is throw around very negatively charged words, which are very damaging to people, then we're not going to get to the point of thinking through how we know what is good and true. And when we can't think through how we know what is good, how we know what's true, then we end up with the subjective ethics of the man with the microphone. We end up with the subjective ethics of those with the power and the money and the platform telling the rest of us what to believe, or what we can even talk about in public. If you start asking these questions, somebody's going to say back to you, all right, where do you get a grounding for tolerance? What's yours? So where do Christians get a basis for tolerance? Well, it's in the image, the fact that all human beings are made in the image of God. And that gives us the absolute mandate to tolerate and respect differing ideas. Now, what I'm not saying is agree with those ideas or think that all ideas are equally beneficial to humans. Right? Tolerating is putting up with something you disagree with. Right? So it's respecting the person who's giving you those ideas. Since all persons are made equally in the image of God, we're called to show them respect. We're called to love them. Right? Recognizing that we're all suffering from the problem of evil. Further, we have that command from Luke 6:27 to love your enemies. Right? These kind of ideas, this kind of grounding is why Christians have developed theories like just war theory, to where we don't just go out and conquer people and take over their lands and to make them serve us, right? We haven't always done great with that. That's why I say rebel with reason and love, because you got to recognize we haven't always done that well. We're called to show everyone love. Right? And this is how Christians come up with a solid grounding for defining tolerance, so that we can make sense of something like this: putting up with a view with which you disagree. Right? To be tolerant, remember, we have to put up with something. Now, one might say, but you know what? Christians behave intolerantly all the time. They constantly do this. And I would say, yeah, they definitely do. We are all human. Right? Just like hypocrisy, when people say, the church is full of hypocrites, and we say, well, yeah, you know what? That's the problem of humans. What was it Bruce Fraser said last night? Yeah, there's a hypocrisy issue in the church. We've always got room for one more hypocrite. Well, intolerance is a problem. It's a human problem, right? We're talking about it on the meta-narrative, the big scale. But when I get up in the morning and I haven't had caffeine, I'm quite intolerant. You don't really want to talk to me yet. But that's a smaller scale of not respecting others. It starts there, right? It's a small scale thing. Well, I don't have to put up with you or respect you because I don't feel well. However, you see that we have a grounding for tolerance. But if you're not going to use some kind of standard for tolerance, if you don't have a standard, and when I say standard, I mean something that is perfectly good and unchanging. If you don't have something like that as your source for understanding what is tolerant versus intolerant, then how could you ever say anything was intolerant ever? How could you ever make this accusation? You couldn't. You really could not say something was truly intolerant. There would be no fixed standard by which to make that judgment. The judgment would become subjective to every individual's view of tolerance, or to their own preferences, or to what they prefer, what they like. It would become subjective to cultural fashion, what we accept as a society, or what has faded out of fashion. So in 50 years, what's tolerant now may be intolerant. We may be intolerant of it as a culture, right? It would just become what's fashionable or subjective. And without an understanding of the source of tolerance, without having a grounding for it, what we see in human history is that the doctrine quickly deteriorates. And you see regimes like Stalin's, where his view of man was he was no different from a blade of grass. And so he could just starve people. And he could just destroy lives. The amount of lives lost under Stalin's regime is factored at around 40 to 60 million. I can't even wrap my mind around that. One is too many, let alone 40 to 60 million. So as the new tolerance begins to settle into the minds of our different societies, a tolerance that has very little room for any disagreement, a tolerance that says love everyone, accept everyone, but means only love those who love you back and hate your enemies. I'm reminded of the words of the great civil rights reformer, Martin Luther King Jr. And he said this: returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding deeper darkness to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate, and violence multiplies violence, and toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction. So when Jesus says, love your enemies, he's setting forth a profound and ultimately inescapable admonition. He goes on to say, have we not yet come to such an impasse in the modern world that we must love our enemies or else? The chain reaction of evil, hate begetting hate, wars producing wars must be broken, or we shall be plunged into the dark abyss of annihilation. So it is of utmost importance to us, to those of you who are followers of the Lord Jesus Christ, that we heed his teaching from Luke 6. That we heed his teaching from Luke 6. Not just for the sake of our own nations, but for our world. We have to become dedicated to starving hatred. We must rebel with reason, reasoning with people, asking questions, leading them towards the truth, helping them to uncover the problematic thinking in their own minds, letting them see their baselessness for tolerance, and letting them see where that leads to. It actually leads to intolerance. We need to help them reason through this. But we must rebel with reason, but do so with a fierce love for people, in a manner that doesn't sound as an annoyance or as a noisy gong, in a manner that is respectful of the past, never losing sight of those who have been marginalized in our communities, and recognizing that we ourselves have often failed to stand up for the marginalized. And we can do this by beginning today. My challenge to you today is to try to see those who are saying awful things about Christians or who make you feel like maybe you can't talk about your Christianity. Start to see them with love. And I know that's a hard task. So maybe if it's just asking God to desire that love for mankind, to desire to break down that polarization.
We hope you enjoyed this presentation. Please consider supporting us to get more content just like this. Visit support.thinkingmatters.org.nz or click on the link in the description. If you really enjoyed this topic and want to go further in depth, I would recommend purchasing The Ambassador's Guide to Postmodernism by Greg Koukl. In this booklet, Greg explains what postmodern philosophy is, where it came from, and how it's invaded even the church. We stock this book in our online store, which you can find a link to in the description.